Hi, friends. I'm Olivia Mattis, and I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Sousa Mendes Foundation to a book launch of this phenomenal new graphic novel, Whistleblowers, about four heroes who tried to warn the US government about the unfolding Holocaust. So we are privileged to have all three of the people who put this book together with us on the panel. First of all, Rafael Medoff. Dr. Rafael Medoff is the head of the Wyman Institute. He's one of the foremost historians on the question of the US response or non-response to the unfolding Holocaust. And he did this project with the renowned graphic artist Dean Motter, best known for his creation called Mr. X, and you're going to see a slide of that, which has been on the stands for more than 30 years. Dean Motter has written for Wolverine, for Superman, and a Batman graphic novel, among many other projects. His work has been nominated for both the Eisner Award and the Kurtzman Award. And the third person that we have with us is an attorney and an activist. His name is Mark Zaid, and he wrote the preface to this book. He represents whistleblowers, modern day whistleblowers, and he is here to, first of all, moderate today's discussion, but also to bring us forward to today. So without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Dr. Rafael Medoff. Rafael, please take the floor.
Thank you, Olivia, and it is, as always, a pleasure to be with you and the Sousa Mendes Foundation and to speak about the important subjects related to the rescue of Jews during the Holocaust, as well as the abandonment of the Jews. In this afternoon's program, I'd like to briefly describe to you some of the main features of our new nonfiction graphic novel, Whistleblowers, and offer you a glimpse of the behind-the-scenes creative process that led to the production of this unique book. The title Whistleblowers refers, in our case, to four specific individuals who, each in his own way, tried to alert America to the Nazi genocide. Now, normally when we think of whistleblowers, we think of individuals inside corporations or institutions who reveal corruption or injustice. Our four whistleblowers are, in a sense, moral whistleblowers who saw injustice and wanted to reveal the truth about Hitler and Nazism to what was then a very skeptical or unbelieving world. Let me tell you very briefly about each of the four who are featured in our book, Whistleblowers. The first, Alan Cranston, is a name you may recognize from American politics. He was, in later life, a longtime US Senator, and in 1948, a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. But what is not widely known about Alan Cranston is that during the 1930s, he was a young journalist, and he discovered that the version of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, which was being marketed in the United States in the 30s, was actually a sanitized or whitewashed version in which the worst elements, the most extreme language and allusions to violence had been removed in order to, in effect, sell Hitler to the American public. Cranston's remarkable campaign to expose Mein Kampf by producing his own version then resulted in a lawsuit by Hitler, who did not want Cranston alerting the American public to what was really in this book. Our second whistleblower was a government attorney. He was an unknown civil servant at the time during the 1940s who stumbled upon the horrible realization that within our own government, within the Roosevelt administration, there were powerful officials who were suppressing news about the Holocaust and even obstructing opportunities to rescue Jewish refugees. Josiah DuBois's willingness to blow the whistle, that is, to risk his career by exposing what was happening inside the US government, is the centerpiece of chapter 2 in our book, Whistleblowers. The third story in Whistleblowers focuses on Henry Morgenthau Jr., Secretary of the Treasury, the only Jewish member of Roosevelt's cabinet. A man who, through most of his career, was very reluctant to bring up Jewish concerns when interacting with President Franklin Roosevelt. But as you'll see in Whistleblowers, circumstances conspired to bring the horrors of the Holocaust to Henry Morgenthau and to inspire him to finally, in effect, blow the whistle and challenge the indifference and abandonment of the Jews. Our fourth whistleblower is the only one who was not an American, Jan Karski, a Polish Catholic, a member of the underground resistance movement in German-occupied Poland. The underground smuggled Karski into the Warsaw Ghetto and into a Nazi concentration camp so he could personally witness atrocities against the Jews, and then he was smuggled out of Europe and brought to the United States, where, among other things, he had a meeting with President Roosevelt in the Oval Office to tell him about the horrors he had eyewitnessed in Europe. Whistleblowers is a unique book in many ways. And first and foremost, of course, is the fact that it's told in comic book form. This is not the way Holocaust historians usually communicate the lessons of history. But my colleagues and I at the David Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies are always looking for new and effective ways to teach about the Holocaust, especially to young people. Now, Whistleblowers is not a book for children. It was written for adult audiences and young adults, but is perfectly suitable for teenagers, even advanced middle schoolers. The idea was that to talk about something so remote and so long ago as the Holocaust, we need a way for, especially for high school and college students, to want to read about it, to find the story more compelling. And therefore, Dean Motter and I collaborated in using the comic book format to tell an old story in a very new way. I want to share with you now a few of the behind-the-scenes artistic images that went into the creation of this book and some of the choices that Dean and I had to make as we proceeded in Whistleblowers. Let's begin with the cover design. At the very start of our collaborative process, when we were looking at possible cover designs, here you see the final image. But the very first images relied, as you'll see, on a traditional kind of comic book style cover concept. You see on the right we have an issue of the Justice League of America, and it's a comic book which features a team up of superheroes. So you have the individual faces running along the edge, and as you see, when Dean first began exploring how to create the cover, he used a similar concept first at the bottom of the page, and then in the second rough draft you see the faces along the left. But in the end, we did not use quite that image, as you'll see in the next slide. But we also had to deal with the question of where the American flag should go in this design. Here you're looking at the progress of the cover from a rough design to the more finished version, then the almost complete version. Notice how the American flag appears in the first one rather prominently. By the second version, the flag is down towards the bottom. It's away from the main artwork. One of the issues that Dean and I struggled with is the fact that this is a book about how Americans responded to the Holocaust. And that story is largely one of tragedy, of abandonment, of indifference. And yet America was, of course, not on the same level as Nazi Germany. On the contrary, America was fighting Nazi Germany in World War II. Young American soldiers were giving their lives in that fight. So even though it's very much an American story, we decided that having the American flag in close proximity to the swastika was simply inappropriate. And that's why you see in the near final version at the right, the flag has been removed altogether. This is all a very typical and natural process of a writer and an artist collaborating and throwing ideas back and forth until we work out the one that satisfies us the most. In the next images, I want to share with you a few of what we call the prelims, or the rough drafts of some of the pages. In the first chapter, and that's the one about Alan Cranston and his attempt to expose Mein Kampf. Here we see two versions of what actually is the same page. On the left, you see a rougher version in which, in the middle panel, you see Cranston's eyes widening as he's looking at the sanitized version of Mein Kampf, which he saw for sale in a store window in Macy's in Manhattan in 1939. But on the right, you see a more finished page, and a number of the concepts here have changed. And at this point, I'd like to invite Dean Motter to explain briefly why this page changed so much from the rough version to the final penciled version.
It was important to show that this was an American setting. And it was especially important to show that it was Macy's. And Macy's is a landmark in New York and has been for decades. And the main thing was to show that he had discovered this in the context of being in the store. I don't know if that was literally true, but that made the most sense, that in shorthand, that we were now in New York City, we're now in Macy's, he had discovered this, and him being curious about this more than shocked seemed to be more appropriate to the script. So that's why it was changed, especially to emphasize the setting.
Thanks. In the next image, what you'll see is another interesting transformation from rough draft to the almost final pencils. On the left, down at the bottom, there's a kind of a very vague allusion to a map. You see Dean wrote a little note for himself at the bottom, Austria map, or maybe German-Austrian map, which I didn't quite appreciate when I saw it in the rough version. But then when the tight, what we call the tight pencils arrived, and I saw this striking image of how Dean had used an actual map to figuratively show Hitler's expansion over Europe, Germany's absorption of Austria, and occupation of Czechoslovakia, and then, of course, invasion of Poland. And by Hitler figuratively strolling across the map, we have a very striking demonstration of Nazi expansionism. In the next image, we finally see the version of Mein Kampf that Cranston published, in which he put all of the most extreme, violent, racist material back in, so that the American public would see the truth about Mein Kampf. There are very few surviving copies of this of the publication, for reasons which I'm not going to explain, so there won't be any spoilers. But I do want to show you a rare actual surviving copy of Alan Cranston's Mein Kampf, which Dean Motter was able to then use as the model that you saw in those pages. And since we're speaking about this remarkable case of Alan Cranston being sued by, in effect, Adolf Hitler, by Hitler's publisher, I'd like to now turn to the author of our foreword, renowned attorney Mark Zaid, who represents contemporary whistleblowers. And Mark, let me ask you, would you, as an attorney, have defended Alan Cranston in court? Did he have enough of a case to defend himself against Adolf Hitler's challenge?
Well, thank you, Rafi, and thank you to Olivia and the Foundation for having us. I was honored to both be here and be involved with the graphic novel. The easy question, or the easy answer to that question, would be I would absolutely have represented him. I will say, even though it was likely known at the time that they were going to lose, which, to be fair, for many whistleblower cases is often the situation we get into. So just a real quick, so my work, I came to this project from a threefold posture. One, representing whistleblowers, particularly in the national security community. Two, being involved with comic books. I'm a part-time comic book dealer for decades. I'm very active in the comic book community. And my maternal grandfather was a U.S. Army chaplain in World War II and liberated Dachau concentration camp. So I had a very unique posture to come into this. Cranston's work, and you slay me every time you show that publication because I cannot find one anywhere, and I desire it very much so. This was a remarkable litigation where Hitler and his American publisher, Houghton Mifflin, which is still around today, sought to obtain an injunction to stop the publication of this 10-cent newspaper versus a $3 Mein Kampf English edition. Initially, they were unable to get an injunction, but the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the middle-level appellate court in New York for several states in the New York area, Connecticut, etc., imposed the injunction and sent it back to the lower court. 500,000 copies had been sold in 10 days. And it was very clear that it was a copying and in violation of the copyright. The primary legal argument was that there was no ability to have a copyright for a stateless person, which Hitler had been in the 1920s, having been born in Austria, fought for Germany, and had lost this Austrian citizenship. But because by the time this litigation was pursued in 1939, 1940, he was obviously the Chancellor of Germany. Part of the reasoning for the court was clearly he was in favor of the publication of this book and seeking to protect it since they had initiated the litigation. The injunction was imposed. About 500,000 copies had to be destroyed, all copies, in fact, and never sold again. But at least no monetary damages were imposed on Alan Cranston or the publishers. But it's a fascinating lawsuit. And if one goes on to the New York Times archives, you can actually find articles of the day discussing the litigation.
Thank you. Another unique aspect of Whistleblowers is our second chapter, which officially is not about a whistleblower. This is the infamous story of the refugee ship, the St. Louis, with which we are all familiar. It tried to bring 930 Jewish refugees fleeing from Hitler to Cuba and then to America, but of course was turned away. The reason we included this story in Whistleblowers is because it has a very important connection to the later chapter about Henry Morgenthau, which I'll be discussing more momentarily. In this story about the St. Louis, Dean and I tell we describe we follow the tragedy of the voyage, but not through the typical comic book style, which would be the writer narrating and a lot of word balloons. There are some of those, but for the most part, the story is actually told through the words of one of the survivors. My colleagues and I at the Wyman Institute were approached several years ago by the family of the late Arthur Weil, who as a young man had been a passenger on the St. Louis, and they told us that he had left behind a diary. Here you see an original typewritten page in German from Arthur Weil's diary. It is only the second known existing diary of a survivor of the St. Louis. Weil kept careful notes during the journey, and then later, as you see, he typed them up. He was one of the lucky ones who survived. As we know, of course, many of the passengers on the St. Louis ultimately were murdered in the Holocaust when the ship was forced to return to Europe. In the pages of the comic book story that Dean and I created, as you see, most of the text appears in the form of these blue-colored boxes, which are actual excerpts from the diary. And in some places, as in panel 1 and panel 4, you see we also included some of the original German right underneath the English translation. But by telling it in Arthur Weil's words, Dean and I felt that the story became more powerful. It's not just a Holocaust historian describing something that happened to other people, and it's not just an artist depicting it graphically, but rather we try to bring the story alive through the eyes of someone who was there. Henry Morgenthau Jr., Secretary of the Treasury, tried but failed to save the passengers on the St. Louis. That little known story is explained in this comic strip. And then it serves as a kind of a prequel to the later story of how Morgenthau was ultimately much more successful in, near the end of the Holocaust, actually helping to bring about policy change. In the next images, we see a brief excerpt from the third chapter, Blowing the Whistle on Genocide, which was about the American civil servant Josiah DuBois and about Secretary Henry Morgenthau and the circumstances that led them to confront the president and in the final months of the war, force Roosevelt to finally take some limited action. The reason I wanted to share with you these two pages is because they contain one of the most striking images in the entire book, Whistleblowers, but which interestingly did not appear in the page on the left. It wasn't in the original penciled version, but by the time Dean got to the final version, you see this remarkable image of the Statue of Liberty in chains, which to me is one of the most striking and moving images in the entire book. And Dean, I'd like to ask you here a little bit about how you came to create this image and why it didn't appear in your original conception of what the page would look like.
When I first read the script, it wasn't clear to me what the idea was that the people had been forbidden to enter the United States, that the United States had been cut off. And I wanted to have kind of an editorial cartoon approach to the image, to some kind of image that said that, told that. There was no real good way to narratively or literally show that. So I had to come up with a symbolic way, as I say, an editorial cartoon approach. And the idea of iron gates being chained, forbidden the entry into the United States by these refugees was important. I originally had the Statue of Liberty bound in chains, but it seemed to send the wrong message. It had the wrong idea. The idea of the iron gates and the chains blocking off access to the country seemed more important. So that is the kind of the natural way that I came to that image.
What you'll also see in Whistleblowers is one particular page which actually has no words whatsoever. This was my tip of the hat to a kind of a comic book tradition. There are a number of famous comic books. One was an issue of Batman, which you see a sample from here, which are known as silent comics or wordless comics, in which a writer and an artist managed to create an entire story which can be understood even though there is not a single word balloon, thought balloon, or narration box. And by using this checkerboard image, Dean and I created a page that wanted to convey how it is that Josiah DuBois, this unknown civil servant in the Treasury Department, how he might have felt as he was reading this news about the mass murder of the Jews that his own colleagues in the State Department were suppressing. So here we use this scene of a little girl symbolizing the Jewish victims, and how it go. You see how the artistic flow goes back and forth between DuBois in Washington and this little Jewish girl in Nazi-occupied Europe. The symbol of the doll falling from her hand in the very last panel was something that had great meaning for me as the writer. It is a reference to this image by the late great artist Neal Adams, a very famous comic book artist, with whom I had the honor of working on a different project for the Disney Educational Division. It was called They Spoke Out, American Voices Against the Holocaust. And for that project, Dean had created this extraordinary image of German soldiers violently separating a mother from her children. And as you see, the doll is beginning to fall from the girl's hand to the ground. And it is that image of the falling doll that I had in mind, and the memory of our friend and colleague Neal Adams and his important contributions to Holocaust education through comics and cartoons. In the next image, I wanted to show you, wanted to just give you a glimpse of the kinds of the questions that an artist has to grapple with in conveying different moods and scenes, and different color palettes come into use. On the right, you see this is a time-honored challenge the comic book artists face: how to depict night in a way that feels like night but isn't so dark that you can't make out the figures. Here Dean did an obviously beautiful job of making it clear that this is night through the use of this off blue, and of course you see the moon there in the third panel, but without obscuring the actual artistry. In the final panel of these two pages, you see a scene of an execution. This was an important consideration with which Dean and I wrestled throughout the creative process: how to show the Holocaust, but without doing it in a way that would be so graphic or so crude that it might feel tasteless. Obviously, as a historian, I want all depictions of the Holocaust to be authentic. On the other hand, there are times when showing even a glimpse of the true ghastly horror of the Nazi atrocities could be so overwhelming that it might detract from the messages of the book. So again and again, we try to allude to the mass murder of the Jews, but without necessarily making it in your face or overly bloody kind of imagery. And you'll see this again in the next page, also from the 4th chapter, Karski's Mission. In the second panel, you see two members of Hitler Youth who have just been shooting Jews at random, but their victims are not in the panel. What you see is a smoke rising from the pistols, which I felt was a very effective way that Dean alluded to what these killers had just done, but without having to show actual piles of bodies, so to speak. We wanted to leave enough time for questions from the audience. I'll be glad to field your questions, as will Dean and as will Mark Zaid. Just one final word about Mark's authorship of the foreword. For my colleagues and I at the Wyman Institute, the ultimate goal of creating a book like this, or the other programs and publications that we undertake, is to teach about the Holocaust not as a matter of curiosity or as a way to get people to feel sorry for the Jews, but rather to transmit important moral lessons from the Holocaust so that the next generation can learn from them. So in writing and drawing about whistleblowers in the 1940s, it was very important for us to make it clear that from our point of view, there is an important link, that whistleblowers in every generation play a vital role as moral exemplars in our society. And so Mark Zaid, as the best known attorney representing courageous modern day whistleblowers, seemed to us the obvious choice for to write the foreword, and we're honored that he was able to participate in this project. And now I'd like to ask Mark to moderate any questions from the audience.
Sure.
Actually, before we get to the audience Q&A, I'm just going to take the opportunity to make a few announcements. And that will give Mark the opportunity to consolidate the questions that have already come in, and it will give you, our beloved audience, a chance to continue asking questions. So first, let me just say I saw that there are some questions in the chat about how to order the signed and inscribed book that we are offering. So we will put the link in the chat in a moment, and also after the program is done, you will be receiving an email and it will have a link. And so your purchase through the Susan Mendez Foundation obviously supports our work, and you can designate who you would like the book to go to, whether to a beloved child or grandchild, or to yourself or to a friend, and what you would like the inscription to say. So we have a limited number of copies. Please order yours, and it's really quite beautiful. You've been seeing some of the images, and this is something you will for sure want to add to your home library or the library of those that you love. 4 stories of inspiration. What could be better? So right now I'd like to tell you about 2 programs that we have upcoming. So our next program is in fact next week. And next week we are focusing on a fascinating, really important figure. His name was Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He was a theologian and a rabbi and a good friend of Martin Luther King. He was one of the leaders of the civil rights movement. He was a Holocaust survivor. He wrote a book called The Prophets that Martin Luther King owned and heavily annotated. And in some ways, Rabbi Heschel was himself the prophet together, or the prophet for Martin Luther King, or with Martin Luther King, of this remarkable moment and a remarkable time of friendship also between the African American and the Jewish communities. So there's a film called The Radical Audacity of Rabbi Heschel, and we will show you the trailer in just a few moments. So that's the film we will have next week. We're going to have the filmmaker. We're also going to have Rabbi Shai Held, who is Rabbi Heschel's biographer. And it's a program you will not want to miss. The program following that will be on April 7th. And on that program, we have a very different subject. We're looking at the island of Majorca and its secret Jewish history. There were Jews in Majorca from hundreds of years back who were persecuted by the Inquisition and had to outwardly profess Christianity, and their Judaism had to really go underground. The name of the community evolved. It became known as the Shweta community. And there's this man, an American filmmaker who's moved to Majorca, who tells their story in this remarkable new film called Shweta Island. So again, we will have the filmmaker for that program, and we will also have a young woman who herself is a member of this hidden Jewish community, the Shweta community. So again, a story you'll see nowhere else, and we hope you'll sign up. So right now, we're just going to show you a little trailer of the film on Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Go home or go to your church. Your march will not continue.
On the front lines of the historic Civil Rights March in Selma, Alabama, standing along with Martin Luther King Jr., is one of the most remarkable religious figures of the 20th century, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel.
I think they became friends, but more than friends, they became brothers.
He was the authority on the prophets, but on this occasion, he was the prophet.
Abraham Heschel is plucked from the fire of the Holocaust that will take the life of his mother and sisters. And in 1940, he arrives in America.
And he's already come out of this magnificent dynasty of rabbis that go back for centuries. He's part of a dynastic royalty.
He lived in excruciating ways with the reality that as the world and the family he grew up in was destroyed in Europe, most of the world was in fact indifferent.
Remember, in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible.
Over the next 3 decades, Heschel fights indifference through his vision of a God who seeks to partner with humanity.
To be in real connection to God was to be in awe and radical amazement at the universe that God had created.
And his love for the prophets of the Hebrew Bible who dare speak truth to power.
And Heschel taught that each of us has a choice to make. What side of history do we ultimately want to land on?
He was kind of a theological Hemingway. He wrote in short, pithy aphorisms of enormous power.
Heschel plays a pivotal role in reshaping the contentious relationship between Catholics and Jews.
But I also have to remind them that my being Jewish is so sacred to me that I am ready to die for it.
And he risks being in the forefront of the protests against what he believes is an immoral war in Vietnam.
My father was attacked for so many of the public positions that he took. My father wouldn't be quiet. No one could silence him.
I am an optimist against my better judgment. Somehow I believe in God, and somehow I believe and am convinced that he will have mercy and pity. more than we deserve.
Wonderful. So at this point, I'd like to turn the floor over to Mark. Mark, go ahead.
Thank you, Olivia. So we do have a few questions that have been posed and some more are coming in. And this might be the first one good for Dean or Rafi and or me, but I'll let you guys do this. What's the difference between a graphic novel and a comic book format?
A comic book is basically a magazine format. It's a inexpensive item that's available or was available normally on newsstands and on shelves. The graphic novel was a more a broader term that could encompass anything from the works of Lind Ward to the modern day works of someone like work like Mouse. But these would be book format, longer stories, usually for an older audience or a broader audience or a different audience. That's how I would distinguish them. They're pretty much a format difference.
And next one, the comment was made the person believed the majority of the St. Louis passengers survived. Could you discuss the Auschwitz Protocol, Karl Lutz, the Bergson Group, I'm going to mispronounce, John Peel, P-E-H-L-E, and the questionable role of Stephen Wise? And I would imagine that is to you, Rafi.
Well, I think that would take, those four topics would take four separate programs, but I'll just briefly address the first one. So when the St. Louis approached the shores of the United States, the President Roosevelt had several choices. Now, there was a quota for a maximum number of German citizens, which in this case meant Jews, who could be allowed into the United States in any given year. It was about 26,000. In 11 of President Roosevelt's 12 years in office, that quota was not filled because his policy was to suppress Jewish immigration below what the law actually allowed. In fact, in most of those 11 years, it was 25% filled, meaning 75% of the quota places that could have been used to allow Jews to escape Nazi Germany and come to America legally under the existing law were not ever used. But as it happens, the 1 year that the quota was filled, the German quota was filled, was the year that the St. Louis tried to reach the United States. So President Roosevelt could not simply announce that he was admitting those refugees since the quota was filled. But as you'll see when you read Whistleblowers, that's where Secretary Morgenthau comes into the story, because Morgenthau raised with the President and the Secretary of State the idea of allowing the St. Louis passengers to go temporarily to the U.S. Virgin Islands. It happened that the governor and legislative assembly of the Virgin Islands had offered to open their doors to Jewish refugees a few months earlier, following the Kristallnacht pogrom in Germany. President Roosevelt was not willing to allow the St. Louis passengers to go to the Virgin Islands because he thought they would use it as a stepping stone to eventually enter the mainland U.S. The ship was turned away and it was forced to go back to Europe. During the 2 weeks that it took in those days for the ship to cross the Atlantic and get back to Europe, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee undertook negotiations with other European governments, and 4 of them agreed to each take a portion of the passengers: England, France, Belgium, and Holland. Now, the St. Louis passengers who went to England, to France, Belgium, or Holland briefly thought that they had been saved, but in less than a year, those countries were overrun by the German army. And the Jews, the St. Louis passengers who were briefly admitted to those countries were murdered in the Holocaust at about the same rate as other Jews in those countries. The lucky ones were the ones who by chance had chosen to go to England, since that was the one of the 4 countries that, as we know, was not invaded. So in the end, many of the passengers of the St. Louis were murdered in the Holocaust, along with the other Jews in those countries that had briefly taken them in.
So, Ravi, you had mentioned earlier, in fact, about that this graphic novel is, of course, not for kids. And in fact, modern comics really aren't for kids any longer. Average age is usually about 27 years old now, versus when many of us were reading, probably many on this program were reading comics. It was kids who were reading it, 7 to 15-year-olds. As a follow-up, one question that was asked was, from the lessons you've learned in not only doing this graphic novel, but definitely the ones you've done before that some might not know of, do you have any suggestions for producers striving to appropriately depict the events of October 7th?
Well, I imagine that the Hamas pogrom on October 7th will eventually find its way into comic book format. And that's important because then it's much more likely to be read by the young Americans who will be our nation's leaders in the years to come. The writers and artists who take on the project of telling October 7th in comic book form will face some of the same challenges that Dean and I wrestled with in creating Whistleblowers. First of all, how much of the horrific details of what Palestinian Arab terrorists did on October 7th can be told in graphic images that will not leave readers so uncomfortable that they won't be willing to turn the page. So when you speak of grisly slaughter, beheadings of babies, gang rapes, and so forth that took place on October 7th, clearly the writers and artists who take on that project are going to have very sensitive material to deal with and very difficult questions. But in the end, it will be a very important, I would say, a noble project to tell the truth about what happened for the exact same reason that we're telling the stories in Whistleblowers, so that nobody will forget, and so that we will learn from those experiences, so that the response of the international community to these kinds of horrors will be more effective and more active than they have been in the past.
So another question is about what, in a sort of a two parts, and I can take the second part of it. What explains the current ignorance about the Holocaust amongst the youth in Western countries? And then he ties, or whoever wrote this then tied it to what extent are American whistleblowers, and it was cited as Snowden, Grush. Grush was someone who's connected to the UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena now, are adequately protected by current American law. So let me start on that aspect very shortly, because of course I teach classes on this topic too. It could take forever to do. Rafi mentioned in the beginning that the whistleblowers depicted in this graphic novel aren't necessarily the whistleblower type status we would look at today. I mean, the laws, of course, were very different back then. They weren't necessarily revealing illegality, unlawful conduct, misconduct in the United States government, although one could make that argument that the failure of the government to act constituted misconduct, but not what we would normally look at for whistleblower protection today. In the national security context, you can't be a lawful whistleblower to disclose classified information. You have to go about it through a proper way. But that way, someone like Snowden, who many would consider to be a whistleblower as sort of perhaps a moral standpoint, like Rafi had mentioned with respect to what was motivating the individuals in the graphic novel, but they wouldn't have any lawful protection that could enable them to not suffer retaliation in whatever form that might take. I'll just say in closing, the US has some of the strongest whistleblower laws on the books. Doesn't mean in practical application that's how it plays out. Very often it sadly does not. We saw most recently a whistleblower about Boeing Airlines. Unfortunately, it looks like he committed suicide. There's a lot of stress involved with being a whistleblower. You can imagine what the individuals in this graphic novel went through as they were trying to promote intervention in the US government, knowing what was or suspecting what was happening overseas. In fact, my grandfather's mother committed suicide because she lost contact with her German family, her brother, during the Nazis. She was already here in the United States. And when my grandfather helped liberate Dachau, and he got there in April of 45, he found out that, in fact, his uncle, her brother, had unfortunately been killed there a couple of years earlier. Rafi, I'll turn it back to you on the current ignorance about the Holocaust among youth in Western countries.
Our publisher, a dark horse, Yo Books, is marketing Whistleblowers both to general audiences and to schools, to the educational market. The question of Holocaust education is a matter of urgency for teachers all across our country. In 35 of our 50 states, Holocaust education is required by law or by local boards of education. So every year, teachers throughout America face the challenge of finding new and effective ways to talk about a very difficult subject, the Holocaust, and in our case, the American response to the Holocaust. For the average high school student or college student, the Holocaust may seem like a very distant subject. It took place a long time ago in a faraway country, and so it's a challenge for educators. So we hope that Whistleblowers will be a tool in the hands of teachers, so that they can combat the education, the ignorance to which this question alluded. For a young person growing up in America today, maybe it's not so surprising that he or she may not know a lot about the Holocaust, and so we hope to try to impact that problem. But by focusing on Americans in particular, we're hoping that Whistleblowers will make the entire story more relevant. In other words, how did our president, our Congress, our public respond to genocide and human rights abuses that were going on in those days? It's an important question because, as we know, the Holocaust was not the final genocide. It seems that every generation finds itself confronted with the same moral challenge. To what extent should Americans care? To what extent should we intervene? And Whistleblowers, one of the important aims of Whistleblowers is indeed to galvanize through education and to show examples of Americans who did stand up as a way of hopefully inspiring people in our own time to likewise stand up against injustice.
Okay. Another question, was Peter Bergson considered a whistleblower? I guess I can answer that too. It probably in the same way of the other occupants or stories in the graphic novel would be. I don't know a lot about him, and maybe Rafi might want to add more, but I don't think he'd be considered a whistleblower like in my line of work. Rafi?
Well, Peter Bergson was an important political activist, an activist for the rescue of Jews from the Holocaust in the United States in the 1940s. He could very easily be the subject of a sequel, of a Whistleblowers Volume 2. What he and his colleagues did was they undertook a campaign of a public protest, rallies, lobbying in Washington, full-page newspaper ads, and other kinds of dramatic and sometimes unorthodox protests in the 1940s to draw attention to the persecution of the Jews in Europe, and especially to try to put pressure on President Roosevelt to do something to intervene against the Holocaust before it was too late. In Whistleblowers, we look at individuals such as Josiah DuBois and Henry Morgenthau Jr., who were inside the American government. Bergson was one of those shouting from the outside. And I've had many occasions to write about his activism in the past, and perhaps one day he will be the subject of a comic book or graphic novel form of history telling.
And the last question, at least that I have in writing so far, is what were the primary reasons given for squelching the whistleblowers' info that is depicted in the graphic novel, which obviously are very different answers for each of them. So maybe the way to put it and have you address, Rafi, is what was the impediment within the US government not to listen to those who were bringing forth information, whether it be those who escaped the camps or who were being told on the inside that something was going on that Roosevelt and the others didn't act on?
Well, every president's foreign policy decisions are usually a combination of political calculations and personal inclinations. And Franklin Roosevelt was no different. As much as we revere him for his leadership of America out of the Great Depression, for the advances of the New Deal, and for America's effort in World War II, we also have to frankly confront the fact that there were opportunities to rescue Jews, which he turned away from. Part of the reason, the political calculation, has to do with his perception that it would be unpopular, that is politically unpopular, to allow more Jewish refugees into the United States. But historians have also discovered many private remarks that Roosevelt made about Jews, disparaging remarks about Jewish influence and Jewish control, and other kinds of derogatory references that make it clear that on a personal level, he also did not want significant numbers of Jewish refugees coming into America. That is not to say that he wanted them to be persecuted or killed by the Nazis, certainly not, but that he saw it as a political problem to admit more of them. Now, FDR did not say that in public. It would have obviously seemed harsh, cold. So instead, when directly challenged on the issue, he would often just simply change the subject. And a classic example you'll see in the fourth and final chapter of Whistleblowers concerns the famous Holocaust hero Jan Karski, the Polish Catholic underground courier. Now, that chapter of the book originated in a project that was generously sponsored by the Jan Karski Educational Foundation, to whom Dean and I are very grateful for their support in making it possible to create that chapter, which then became part of Whistleblowers. In that story, you will see Jan Karski smuggled out of Europe, risking his life in order to reach the United States, and actually being granted a face-to-face meeting in the Oval Office with President Roosevelt. Karski explained to the president what Karski had seen in the Warsaw Ghetto, the kinds of atrocities that are depicted in our comic book telling of the story. And yet, as you'll see, what the president did essentially was to change the subject. He was simply not interested in talking about it because he was not interested in taking action to intervene against it.
And Ravi, it touches upon a little bit what you were just saying about Roosevelt's attitude towards Jews. So there were some questions where people were asking about whether he was actually anti-Semitic, which I think you kind of touched upon, or people can insinuate from it. But a supplement to it were whether members of the State Department anti-Semitic, and the role that Eleanor Roosevelt played with respect to trying to actually allow Jews to be entered into the United States.
The First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, took a much more sympathetic interest in the plight of the Jews in Europe than did her husband. But the steps that she actually took were very limited. They're important to recognize. And one might say that maybe the president wouldn't have listened to her anyway. Certainly when she tried to push him on the issue of African-American civil rights, he was just as difficult and indifferent as when she raised the issue of the Jews. So there's an important question as to what realistically she could have accomplished.
And I think, yeah,
yes.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. I was just going to say, as we're coming to the close, that obviously the graphic novel is obviously about Jews and comic books and this interaction. For those who are interested in just the topic of Jews and comic books, the history of comic books is very much that of Jewish history. Most of the creators of so many of the famous characters we know today, from the 30s, the 40s, into the 60s, and to today, of course, but the early characters were mostly created by Jews. Many of them changed their names. Rafi and I and Dean, we could do a totally separate lecture on this, do a college course on it. But the role that Jews have played in the history of comic books is really interesting. Superman himself, his His given Kryptonian name is Kal-El, which is essentially a Hebrew name. And Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who created the character, were Jewish young men, high school fellow classmates in Cleveland, Ohio. The topic of the Holocaust, as Rafi has documented a whole bunch of times, it took quite a while to make it into comic books, but that's predominantly because, again, those were for children, and it wasn't going to be a topic that was going to be confronted really in the 40s or into the 50s. Nowadays, everything can be confronted, which is why I agree at some point, as Rafi said, October 7th will no doubt be depicted in graphic novel form as well. I think the final question as we close, just to ask, again, is going to probably take too long to give a real answer, but how did the New York Times contribute to suppression of the camps by not discussing perhaps what it knew?
Well, let me offer that as my final word, my final thought on the subject for this afternoon. Our news media play a very important role in potentially in alerting the world to atrocities that take place in various countries. And so they have a tremendous responsibility because they can have an enormous impact. And they do. They shape public opinion. But tragically, during the Holocaust, the New York Times regularly buried news about the mass murder on the back pages. It's not that the Holocaust was unknown. As Professor Laurel Leff has amply documented in her critically acclaimed book, Buried by the Times, like other major media, did receive news from its correspondents and other sources about what the Nazis were doing to the Jews. Not as quickly as we receive news today, but certainly in time for there to have been some kind of intervention or action. But instead, the Times often took news about the mass killing of the Jews and confined it to the back pages or did not report it at all. It won't be long before historians are looking at the events of October 7th and likewise finding troubling ways in which today's news media have depicted Israel as some kind of villain, when in fact Israel has been the victim of one of the greatest atrocities since the Holocaust.
I also wanted to address something, which is that the idea of having a comic book about the Holocaust is something that used to be taboo, something that could not be done. And that taboo, I think, was largely broken by Maus. Isn't that right?
Yes, the book Maus by Art Spiegelman was the pioneering work in this field. It told the story of Spiegelman's own parents, what they had endured in the Holocaust, but done in comic book form. And in the 1980s, when Maus first came out, it was quite a radical approach to talking about the Holocaust. Today, of course, it is becoming more mainstream, and if Whistleblowers ultimately is regarded in the same category as Maus, then I think Dean and I and Mark will feel that we have accomplished something significant.
Yes, please, everybody buy this book. We have 250 people in our audience. We don't have copies for all of you, just the next 20 or so people, because there have been some people ordering it during the program. So hurry up and order yours, please. Also, we at the Sousa Mendes Foundation, we had a graphic novel. It is now out of print about the Sousa Mendes story. We will make a new edition at some point soon, I promise. So that's it. So I wanted to thank our illustrious panel. Dean Motter, what a masterpiece you made with this book.
Thank you.
Rafael, finding that diary and having it be the basis of the book, that is so original. And Mark, thank you for lending your name also to this wonderful publication. And of course, thank you all for being on our panel. Thank you to our wonderful audience. See you next week, everybody. Be well. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.